David Petrokarakos, maybe I could turn to you at this stage. With your enormous experience of the sanctions against Iran, what can you say about whether or not they're the right kind of sanctions and whether or not they're being implemented?
Looking at the sanctions on Iran, the first question is, have they in and of themselves brought Iran back to the negotiating table, as we've seen them in Istanbul recently and then more recently in Baghdad? In and of themselves, the answer must be no. However, they are one more tool that is being used diplomatically that has proved effective in conjunction with other tools. In fact, what they have done is actually build on Iran's own economic incompetence. They are targeted, and they're targeted twofold. The first is they're targeting Iran's oil and gas. The second thing they're doing is they're isolating Iran from the international financial system. So Iran now finds it very difficult to undertake dollar transactions and therefore has to rely on third parties who are of dubious origin and often unreliable. Now, by hitting Iran's oil exports, they're really hitting it where it hurts. And the EU oil sanctions that will come in on the 1st of July will make Iran suffer. Equally, they have targeted specific individuals in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard. Now, these people are very important internally in Iran, and they have the power. And when they suffer, the regime suffers, and they in turn put pressure internally on the leaders to try and come to some sort of compromise.
Dimitri, can I turn to you at that stage? What's the view from Moscow on the sanctions against Iran? Because obviously Russia did agree to sanctions through the UN Security Council, but equally Russia and China sought to dilute the sanctions so Iran's hydrocarbon sector that David was just referring to were not targeted.
Russia not only approved the sanctions barring arms exports to Iran, but Russia actually had some financial losses because of that, because we had to cancel the contract on delivering S-300 anti-aircraft missiles to Iran. So obviously there were some financial losses. As for not targeting Iran's oil industry, well, I think it's not in the interest of Russia and of the whole world that oil price would suffer another major hike, because rising oil prices may look like a boon to Russia's economy, but in fact it just kills any kind of industry, any kind of production that we have inside the country. The money that we make on our oil abroad just kills all initiative here. So basically, I think Russia did not support economic sanctions against the Iranian oil sector, not because it wanted a quick buck right now, but precisely because, in principle, it's a very, very dangerous strategy to make the whole global industry suffer because of the sins of one government.
Is that a point that anybody else can pick up on? Sanctions, of course, don't only hurt the country they're being targeted at, they also have a knock-on effect on the global economy and affect the businesses in the country that's imposing the sanctions.
The UN Charter makes provision for countries that are hit as collateral damage of sanctions, but that has rarely ever been used, that provision. Sanctions will always have some sort of backlash in terms of the economy. That's not only the case with UN sanctions. When you impose bilateral sanctions as countermeasures, for example, which effectively is your only way for enforcing international law in a decentralized international structure, you will have to suffer the backlash. So when it comes down to deciding whether you will impose sanctions or not, this comes into the equation. And if you decide to go on with sanctions, then you have to accept that there will be significant damage and destabilization for yourself.
Back to you, Dimitri, in Moscow. Is it not a good idea for the world to get together, even if it costs us a little bit of money and a little bit more on the oil prices, to stop Iran potentially from getting a nuclear weapon?
I'm not sure it's a good idea, because obviously Iran was terrified by what happened to its neighbor, Iraq. And Iran is terrified by the almost open taking sides by the West in the conflict in nearby Syria. So I guess if I were an Iranian, I would indeed be very much troubled by what's going on around my country. And one of the possible solutions, especially for the nationalist Iranians, is to try to get a nuclear weapon so that you would not be attacked. We know North Korea recently acquired some kind of a dirty bomb, and I would point your attention that we're hearing a lot less about a possible war between the United States and North Korea than we hear about a possible war between the United States and Iran. I think what we need is indeed some sort of a detente that would calm passions, and then probably the Iranian nuclear threat would not seem as pressing as it seems now.
David, can I put that one to you? Is it possible that the sanctions against Iran and this threat of use of military force is actually what is pushing Tehran towards developing nuclear weapons?
Well, I think they're two separate issues here. I don't think the sanctions in and of themselves are pushing Iran towards a nuclear weapon. The idea of the threat perception that Iran may feel, then that could well be true. If you are an Iranian, then it is logical that you'd have a nuclear deterrent. You've been dealing with a USA that has been openly talking about regime change for 30 years, a nuclear-armed America. Israel has nuclear weapons, and for many years its primary adversary in the Middle East, Iraq, had a nuclear program. But one point I think people haven't made yet is that actually sanctions do perform another function, is that they're often seen as an alternative to military action. So in the Iran case, there is a huge camp, particularly coming out of the neocon American right for many years, that advocated overthrowing Iran. The sanctions being put on them do mollify these people to a certain extent, whereas diplomacy and mere talking doesn't. So actually I think the sanctions, if anything, cool things down. What would drive Iran toward a bomb is, I think, an attack on Iran. Then it would leave the NPT, have all the excuses to do so, and then make a full-out dash toward a nuclear bomb.
Dr. Lee Jones.
The research on sanctions would contradict what you're saying, really, David, because if we look at cases where military force or other measures don't accompany sanctions, then the success rate is as low as 4%. So sanctions are often sold as being this alternative to military action, but more often they accompany military action or are used to prepare the ground for military action, as in the case of Iraq, where the US population was prepared for many years for an attack on Iraq, for example. And in the case of South Africa, it was definitely sanctions which drove South Africa to acquiring nuclear weapons in the 1980s, because it did build up this military-industrial complex. The military were able to get secret funds for sanctions busting and engaged in relationships with other isolated states, such as Israel, which supplied the nuclear material. So I think sanctions can be extraordinarily destabilizing, and away from other measures that would be more destabilizing, like military action, they're not very effective in and of themselves.
Well, in and of themselves, I agree, which is why I said at the beginning, I put in the very important caveat, if used in conjunction with diplomacy and in preference to military action. However, I would say that in the Iran case, even if perhaps it's just post-Iraq, the world had learned the lesson of the disastrous intervention there. The sanctions have been very effective in mollifying the right wing in Washington, Tel Aviv, who are advocating military action all the time by saying, look, guys, we are doing something, they are working, Iran is suffering.
But if that's the case, then sanctions are more effective about managing domestic politics in the sender states than they are about changing political outcomes in the target states, which is my main point.
But I think the relationship between the two can't be divorced, because ultimately they're the two, that's the central relationship that leads to military action or not. And I think that actually managing that central relationship is extremely important. And I think in the Iran case, sanctions have done this quite effectively.
I think Antonius Xanakopoulos wants to get in there as well.
Everybody has their own statistic about how effective sanctions have been. I have one from the Watson Institute at Brown University, which has been working on improving actually the effectiveness of sanctions through fair and clear procedures, which have calculated that sanctions are overall in 1/3 of the cases effective as to changing the conduct of the target in any given situation. But there are intermediate targets as well, which we should not forget. And when I say intermediate targets, we shouldn't evaluate the effectiveness of sanctions just as to whether has Iran come back to the negotiating table, etc., etc., but also in terms of has it been stigmatized, but more importantly, have the sanctions created problems with respect to continuing the particular behavior that it is targeted. For example, when you cut off their access to particular materials that can be used for their nuclear programs, or you make it very difficult for them to go out in the global economy, to buy in dollars, etc., etc., then necessarily you are not convincing them to change their behavior, but you are making it very difficult for them to continue with the behavior that is targeted.